There is a fascinating popularity that arises amongst the analysis of the Gnostic texts. And the Gnostic texts have been known in scholarship for a very long time. In fact, they were known in the early Christian periods of the 4th century, of the 2nd century, and the 3rd century. But the reason why they're so popular today seems to be because of the traditional evangelical idea of Christianity as something completely solid, as the Bible being the absolute dictated, infallible word of God, and that in no way were there any other texts that had to fight for their canonicity, for their truth, as it were. With the existence of the Gnostic Gospels, that seems to come into play. You start to develop this idea that Christianity wasn't something very solid, and because of that idea, it seems to question the validity of these texts of the Gospels as something that was rather selected rather than something that was received and displayed amongst the people. Imagine having the Gospel of Thomas, which is an early 2nd century Gnostic text. That text is rejected, but the letter of Peter is accepted. And this seems to call into question that idea. But I think that the Gnostic Gospels actually tell a different story, and I'll explain why. All of the Gnostic Gospels are 2nd century texts, as everyone will know. But more importantly than that is the idea that the 1st century texts that we do have are polemical in nature. They are heresiological in nature. And what that means is that they were talking against other Christian groups that should have texts of their own, but those texts don't exist. The existence of these texts are only confined to the 2nd century and onwards. And the question has to be asked, why are these 2nd century texts existing after the close of the 1st century, rather than fighting for their canonicity in the 1st century? I think this data might suggest the fact that the 2nd century texts, and more importantly, the 2nd century communities, could only gain any sort of prominence after the age of apostolic men and women had passed, those individuals being the only ones that could actually genuinely critique them. And so when their followers, people who claim to be part of the apostolic register, come along, those individuals seem to have their claims weakened due to the fact that they can't just directly appeal to Paul, Peter, and James, who are long dead and buried.